welcome to Ukraine Today. We're on location in the western Ukrainian city of Chernivtsi for the Meridian Czernowitz 2015 Poetry Festival. It brings together artists, writers and poets from across Europe and indeed across the world. Such is the case with my first guest. It's Ricardo Domeneck from Brazil. Ricardo, many thanks for joining us. This is your first time at the festival. And how are you finding it?
I've been following what's going on in Ukraine because of friends and since 2 years, and I'm very happy to be here and see it firsthand in a way, even though at a festival you get to see the situation in different forms. But I was in Kiev, Kharkiv and Chernivtsi, like 3 very different cities, and you could feel how traveling from west to east and the center actually makes a big difference. I mean, Kharkiv, Kiev and Chernivtsi strike me as extremely different cities.
But I think that perhaps while we're here in the festival, it's something of a bubble, we might say, because everyone's of course in a good mood and in a festival mood. But at the same time, we feel that there is this war going on in the background. Is that something that's been reflected for you in what you've seen here so far?
It was strange. I mean, I arrived on the 31st of August. It was the night, the day that the grenade exploded in front of the parliament and left by now 3 dead, I think. At the same time, it was very strange, like the city, Kiev, seemed so peaceful and so clean, and people just seemed to be going on with their lives. The only thing what was clear was just the sheer number of soldiers and militiamen and policemen on the streets. It's the first time I'm in a country which is officially at war, but had it not been for the soldiers, for the incredible number of soldiers, I think I probably wouldn't have realized it. At the same time, it's of course it comes in conversation often. But what I have also realized is how people somehow don't want to talk only about that. There's like this feeling that that life has to continue, and with some people they actually told me, like, please, let's talk about anything but not the war.
And I think the festival here is actually an attempt to do that, to show that there is something more going on here and not just the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way this is important to I think it was referred to at the opening that despite the war we are here to talk about poetry and to read this text, which at the same time are not unconscious of what's going on. I mean, I think several writers have referred to it in their texts. Yesterday, for example, Irina Tsilik, whose husband is on the front, read 2 very beautiful poems about him coming home from the front and her washing his clothes and then being in bed with him, which was very, very, very touching to be witnessing a poet talk about this in the present. I mean, last year especially, with the celebrations of the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and then this year, because of the anniversary of this end of the Second World War, we talked a lot about war and poetry. So the poets who died in the First World War, soldiers and so on. And for me, it was and I wrote a lot about that last year. So it's very strange and at the same time very touching to be here and listen to poetry being written right now about a war which is happening right now, which is leaving dead right now.
So there's a sense of urgency, perhaps, which we don't feel when we talk about World War I or World War II. We've had a bit more time to understand and reflect upon how those conflicts have shaped our society and our thoughts. But with East Ukraine, it seems that we don't quite know even how that is influencing us yet and how it's going to influence us in the future.
There is a sense of urgency and the danger of speaking in the heat of the moment, and you cannot think of something more heated, a more heated moment than a war. And you just don't have time you don't have time sometimes to reflect, and unless you know the country very well and its history and the background, the entire background of previous wars and previous conflicts with other countries and the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, it's very hard to pinpoint what's happening. So that's why, I mean, for me as a foreigner, it's decisive to listen to Ukrainian poets, and no, but not only. I think for me it has been very important to talk also to people who are not writers, and see how they feel about it. So there's this sense of like this, like you said, an urgency, at the same time this need not to be engulfed by the war in everything, in everyday life, and even in speech and so on. So it's hard to know. I mean, for me, we get very conflicting news in Western Europe. It's very hard to know exactly what is happening and what the reasons are for everything. I was talking to some writers in Kiev, for example, and I voiced some opinions which come from the Western media, and then some of them corrected me in the sense of like, listen, it's not that simple, and it's always the danger also in news, that you're not getting the full picture, and something clean of ideology as well, clean of interests. So I think writers are very good for that, at least. I mean, not that we are not shaped by ideology, but you know, I think like a poet has more time, at least, to reflect on what's happening, and he doesn't have to spit out an article 3 hours after something happened because it has to be online.
A lot has been written about the influence of Russian media in this conflict in East Ukraine, and about how in our era, with the influence of postmodernism, there is no objective truth, but there is the version that they tell us in the Russian media, there is the version that we have in the West, and both are equally valid. But for you, is there something more objective?
I think we have to know always what interests are at stake, and that there are interests in Russia concerning Ukraine, and there are interests in the US, in the West concerning Ukraine. I think that the first thing we have to do, and the most honest thing to do, is to listen to the Ukrainians, because it's affecting the Ukrainians. It's Ukrainian lives being lost, and so on. So I think sometimes the West, and I can only speak in that sense because that's why I live in Berlin, and that's the media I have the most access to. I don't speak Russian. I don't know exactly what's being said in Russia, in Russian media. But I think they should give more voice to Ukrainians in the West. And of course there are interests here. You will have Ukrainians maybe whose interests align with Western interests, as there will be Ukrainians whose interests align with Russian interests. But I think we just can't be naive and forget that there are geopolitical aspects to the whole thing which make it extremely complicated. It's a very important region geopolitically. It's not, there are interests here which are not just Ukrainian national interests, and which must be very difficult for Ukrainians, because of course it meddles with their lives.
And is it important for you to see the conflict and the impact it actually has physically on people? As much as you might have already gained some impressions of the mental impact, do you also need to see it?
Yeah, I think it would be important if I were to try to actually write about the war in any sort of more direct way. I don't think I can without, I don't think you could without seeing the conflict. Otherwise it just becomes an abstraction. It becomes an allegory of every war. And I think it's unfair, and it's just not ethical with the people who are actually suffering with this war. I don't want to turn this war into an allegory of all wars. It doesn't make sense. And unless you see what's actually happening, and you can't unless you go to Donetsk, it's very difficult. So I think like what I can do as a writer is try to, in first place, like bring Ukrainian poetry outside Ukraine, and the conversations I have had with people here, to make these voices heard outside of Ukraine, in Berlin, and then in Brazil, especially in Brazil, because I'm writing basically in Portuguese. And I think that's the only role I can play, is to listen, to be here to listen. I think that's what anybody should be doing who's from outside the country, listening, and then trying to, with some knowledge, responsibility, some knowledge of what has happened already in the country before, to try to let these voices be heard outside of Ukraine.
Ricardo Domeneck, many thanks for joining us here at the Meridian Czernowitz Festival. This has been Rahim Tula with Brazilian poet Ricardo Domeneck here in Chernivtsi at the Meridian Czernowitz 2015 Poetry Festival.